Okay, hello everyone. My name is Bani, and I'm an artist and musician. Most of my work revolves around this interest or fascination to develop, in a sense, new musical instruments or musical interfaces as a means to, which are sort of like products or byproducts of my various things that I've been looking into, various research or interests that I've been sort of like obsessing over. Instruments as a way to understand, to measure, to make sense of these different worlds or spaces that I'm like looking into and investigating. So my work as an artist revolves around this desire to always develop new instruments to be able to think through some of these spaces and general fields of study, if that's one way of putting it. So with regards to the work that I've been obsessing over with regards to jazz within within Singapore, quite specifically, it all sort of started with a film that was made by P. Ramlee, the late P. Ramlee, back in the 1950s. It's a film called Labu. And if you've seen the film, Labu is a film about two men servants who work for a very, in a sense, evil and stingy boss. His name is Haji Bakhil. And in this film, in the first Labu, it's a series of dream sequences of Labu and Labi, played by P. Ramlee and M. Zain, who sort of dream or imagine what life would be like if they weren't serving this Haji Bakhil or living the life that they do. So it's a very interesting sort of like, to think about kind of speculative fiction or dreaming of other sort of like futures or different tangents of what life could be like, right? And of the many dream sequences that happen, one of them happens to be this strange dream where it is like a fairly typical Western setup. And I say Western to suggest that it's it's a salon. There are people drinking inside this bar. Everyone's kind of like wearing a cowboy hat, dressed up, so on and so forth, and they're just sort of like by the bar hanging out. So in this Western dream, in this Western scene, Labu Labi, who's played by M. Zain. Labu, who's played by M. Zain. He goes by the name Jesse Labu. There's a wanted poster at the beginning of the scene. Wanted Jesse Labu, reward $5,000, dead or alive, something like that. And he enters the bar and everyone's like terrified of him. Moments later, P. Ramlee's character walks in and he doesn't have a name, but when Jesse Labu asks, like, who are you? His character replied, I am the younger brother of Ned King Cole. Now, this point for me was quite interesting because one, you kind of see two figures, one Jesse James, famed, infamous outlaw, blah, blah, blah. And on the other hand, you have, a character that directs you towards a rather famous jazz icon. And I've been sort of like intrigued by this premise or this, grouping, to say the least. What is going on here now? Of course, on the one hand, I think it's quite easy to sort of like, attribute this to how P. Ramlee generally has a kind of fascination for jazz, American culture. At the same time, a lot of his, part of his influence is also sort of like, modeled singing like Ned King Cole. But on sort of like on a speculative frontier, I was sort of like interested in this positioning of what jazz kind of represented as this symbol of freedom, of liberation in that sense, which got me into a rabbit hole thinking and examining what jazz was like, sort of like the history of jazz music. And it kind of brought me into uncovering and learning about jazz during the Cold War, or rather the internationalization of jazz music during the Cold War, and how that sort of like had a huge, role in disseminating, the philosophy, the ideology of not just jazz music, but what the United States kind of stood for during the Cold War. And so the resonances and also the kind of like ripple effects of jazz as this symbol of freedom, of liberation, of democracy, all that jazz, has a kind of residue that is situated in the object itself, and how it sort of like is still present or prevalent during that time. It is a very central, I suppose, material or central component in how jazz was eventually sort of like spread around the world. And so from that point on, I guess a lot of my obsession was kind of like looking into the different trajectories, the different tangents or threads which tied Malaya or Singapore with the sort of like cultural project of jazz during the Cold War. Yeah, so for the work that is currently on that is currently exhibiting, which is titled "We're Not Satisfied with Just Making a Noise." In this work, I was going through historical records that's made available with regards to one of the, probably the only jazz diplomat that toured the region, and this is jazz clarinetist Benny Goodman, who came to Singapore in 1952, if I recall correctly. And as part of his tours within Southeast Asia, the title actually came from like a brief interview that he actually gave at the Singapore Badminton Hall back then. They were sort of like asking about his repertoire, and I think there was a question about the set list that he was sort of like bringing, and his response was, we're not satisfied with just making a noise. So there was a kind of statement that he was also sort of like making, and this record could be found online, part of the Library of Congress's documentation during these cultural tours that occurred. But in any case, for this particular work, what I did was, Singapore Badminton Hall at this point in time is actually closed. I don't think we're able to access that space anymore. So prior to it actually being closed, I did a site visit. I visited that place a couple of times just to sort of like get a sense of the space. And one of the fascinating things about Badminton Hall, as it stood for those few years, were actually these giant fans that's actually just blasting out within the space itself. It's very loud. There's this low hum that fills that space, and I thought it was a very interesting material to sort of like think about the kind of environment, the kind of space, the acoustics of the space back then as well, and what it would have been like, I suppose, with not just Benny Goodman, but basically any kind of sort of like sonic or music activity that happened back then. So for this work, sort of like in response to Benny Goodman's statement in this interview about not just making a noise, the instrument that I kind of worked on was this strange polyrhythmic sampler and sequencer at the same time, where I sampled basically the fans, also the general hums and I guess noise within old Singapore Badminton Hall. And I kind of fed it into this instrument of mine that I worked on pure data, and it basically just generates sort of like new compositions every time it's activated. It's kind of like an autonomous machine or an autonomous instrument that is played every time you experience it in the exhibition. So it's always playing out new iterations, new versions of the sounds that you hear. And I guess in thinking about space acoustics, the kind of environment that filled not just the badminton hall itself, but how jazz kind of like occupied the not just Singapore but the region as well, what it felt like, what it actually caused, what it shaped, so on and so forth. In some ways, I think I was interested to see how an instrument could bend these material, the sonic material, and present something different through it.